Welcome to our channel. Today, we are going to explain a dystopian fantasy drama movie called What Dreams May Come. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The film opens with a young guy named Chris who is spending his vacations in Switzerland. Chris is seen on a boat alone in the middle of the sea. Suddenly his boat collides with another boat of a girl named Annie. Chris finds her bubbly and fruity nature very appealing and adjacent to his own, so he shares some snacks with her. Both ends up falling in love over a few-hour conversations in the middle of the ocean. The two rushed their one-day relationship and marry one another later. Annie gives birth to two children, and Anne-Marie. Chris has a perfect family that one imagines or dreams of. Chris and Annie spend their entire time nurturing and raising Ian and Marie. Their entire life takes a downward spiral when both of their kids dies in a tragic car accident on their way to school. Chris and Annie are seen in a state of shock and grief at the funeral of their young kids. The two are left broken and traumatized for the rest of their lives. Chris and Annie lose their spark in marriage. It almost seems impossible for the two to get back to a normal life. The scene then shifts to 4 years after the tragedy. Chris is seen working in a hospital as a pediatrician. As he's checking out a young patient, he gets a call from Annie, who's working in an art gallery as an artist and an art dealer, and he stresses over her sellers that have not come to display their paintings yet. Chris calms her and suggests displaying her own paintings because he finds them admirable. At first Annie doesn't find it a good idea, but Chris somehow convinces her. Annie reminds him that her paintings are back at home, and she will not be able to display them on time. Chris ensures that he would bring her paintings from home on time. Chris's gesture makes Annie internally happy, so she decides to celebrate their 4-year anniversary and set their differences aside. Chris quickly finishes his appointment with a young kid and rushes back home. On his way he sees multiple car accidents on a highway and runs to save some lives since he couldn't get to save his own children's lives. By the time he reaches a tilted car to free a severely injured woman, Chris gets smashed by another car that had gone flying in the air due to a flat tire. Sadly, Chris dies at the hand of the 911 team when the news is broken down to Annie. She loses her sanity and gets a mental breakdown. She starts blaming herself for the death of her kids and husband and repetitively says that she should have gone to pick her kids up from school, and she should have gone to get the painting herself. At the funeral, Chris' wandering soul is seen placing his hands on Annie's face and trying to console her, but Annie can't see him since he's a spirit now. Although Annie did see a silhouette that someone else, the same silhouette, visits Chris's spirit, who happens to recognize him as his mentor Albert from a medical school. Albert has come to take Chris's spirit, but he isn't ready to go. Chris in fact thinks that he has a chance to make Annie feel his presence. Chris then complains and asks Albert why he's only seen a silhouette of him instead of this human body. Albert smiles and ensures that he can see him whenever he's ready. Subsequently, Annie is seen writing a letter in memory of her late husband. Chris attempts to make Annie feel his existence by moving the pen from her hand into writing that he is here with her, and he wants her to feel his presence. Annie loses her mind and starts breaking things as she believes that she has lost her mind. She starts crying and loses her sense of reality because she believed that no one can get signals from the dead. Later, Annie goes to Chris's grave and cries her heart out. Chris's spirit is also there, and he tries to hug her from behind and give her emotional support, but when Annie doesn't respond or acknowledge him, he realizes that he cannot make Annie or anyone else feel his presence in this world anymore. This devastates him and causes him to leave. Chris's spirit vanishes into thin air. The scene shifts and Chris is seen opening his eyes in another dimension other than Earth. His hand gets dirted in blue slimy mud. He is greeted by Albert, whom he can clearly see now. It is implied that Albert is Chris's guide in the afterlife. Chris looks around him and finds his surroundings very familiar. He takes a few more glances around him and realizes that he is inside the painting of Annie. He also realizes that this was the painting in which he dreamed of living with his family for eternity. Albert tells him that good people ends up in their own world after their death and spend their eternity living in a place that they had always dreamed of. This makes Chris truly happy, and he smiles. After a long time, Chris sees a house that Annie had once painted. Albert and Chris makes their way to the house and goes inside it. Albert makes a hole in one of the walls which turns the painted world into a real world which looks exactly like Annie's painting back on Earth. Annie takes a moment to paint a dark yet beautiful treaty that also emerges in Chris's world. Albert is fascinated to see that and tells Chris that Annie was his true soulmate. That's why her paintings are affecting his world in the afterlife. Soon something happens to Annie and she ruins the painting with water. The tree and Chris' world also sheds all its leaves and gets destroyed. Chris quickly picks up that Annie is not happy on Earth and is left alone, so he starts crying and becomes Devastated, Albert helped him go through this phase. That same day, Chris finds a stuffed toy of his baby girl and becomes hopeful of seeing his kids and getting reunited with them. Sadly, Albert breaks down that everyone gets to live in a world of their own dreams, which means that his kids are getting to live in a world of their own dreams. Chris is deeply saddened to hear that he cannot live with his kids and asks Albert if he can manage to meet his kids somehow. Albert nods and says he can meet his kids whenever he wants and leaves shortly after. Chris is greeted by a beautiful Asian girl who requests him to come to her world. Chris agrees to go with her while he's in a new world. The girl asks how he died on Earth. As the girl talks to him, Chris seems to be lost in his own thoughts. Upon asking, Chris tells the girl that he's missing his daughter after finding her toy. The girl asks Chris how she died and also asks him to remember where his daughter always wanted to end up. Chris then remembers Maurice Heaven Palace and notices that this world looked exactly like that, so he asks the girl how she died and what she always dreamed of. The girl replies that once her father spotted an Asian flight attendant and claimed that Asian girls are always smart and gorgeous. The girl then says that it had become her dream of becoming a smart Asian girl one day, and in her afterlife, she got to be one. Hearing this, Chris immediately realizes that the girl is his daughter Marie because he remembers telling Marie how beautiful and smart Asian women are. He hugs her in excitement and expresses his love to her. He spends quality time with Marie. In return, turns back to his world. Albert shows up in a very upsetting mode when Chris asks Albert the reason behind his upsetting face. Albert reveals that Annie has attempted to commit suicide on Earth and has died. Chris cries in pain because deep down, he knew this would happen. Besides mourning, Chris becomes happy and excited since he can reunite with his wife in the afterlife. But Albert opens his eyes by telling her that Annie has committed suicide, which is a sin, and sinful souls goes to hell. They don't get to live in the world of their fantasy. Chris becomes angry and starts yelling at Albert. He takes an oath to reunite with Annie whether Albert helps or not. Albert tries to talk him out of this decision because the only way to see Annie was to visit hell, and once someone enters the gates of hell they cannot come back. This doesn't change Chris's mind, and his decision remains the same. Seeing this, Albert agrees on helping Albert takes Chris to a library where he introduces him to an old person whom he thinks can take them to hell. Usually no one knows the way to help, but the old man has his ways of navigation. The old man agrees to help them find Annie in hell. Subsequently, Albert and Chris are seen on a boat rowing through a scary dark sea. It is so dark that they have to light lanterns, and a horrifying waves almost sink the boat. All of a sudden the dead rise from the sea and drown their boat. This indicates that they have reached closer to the shore. The trio is seen coming out of the water and landing miles away from the gates of hell. The old man states that he cannot sense Annie's presence and asks them to leave before things get serious. Actually, Chris was thinking about his son, and his son Ian was the only person who was playing in his mind, due to which the old man says that Annie cannot be tracked. In order to get closer to Annie, Chris will have to think more about her. Right now, Chris misses his son and recalls yelling at Iron for not studying hard enough and advising him to always help others instead of hurting them. Chris realizes that Albert is none other than his son Ian because he's following his advice and is helping people even in the afterlife. In fact, he's helping his own father who used to yell at him. When Chris recognizes his son, he hugs Albert tightly and takes a moment to show his love and how much he had missed him there. Iron reveals that he took the form of Albert in the afterlife because he was Chris' mentor, and Chris followed him in every aspect of his life to become a good and accomplished person. Hyan says that it was his dream to become like Albert so that he could impress his father. The old man interrupts their moment and suggests that they should leave Ian outside the gates because if he goes with them there are chances that Chris will not be able to fully think of Annie. Despite a heated argument, Ian stays behind and wishes his father good luck finding Annie. As the old man and Chris enter, they find thousands of skulls stuck in the mud. As Chris is constantly thinking of his wife, he sees her head stuck in the middle of those skulls. He tries to go near her, but the ground sinks and Chris falls into a pit. Chris finds himself in a dark and depressing environment. He also sees a broken home, which he realizes was Annie's dream home. He goes inside to look for her, but the old man approaches and tells him that he has 3 minutes to remind Annie of who she is because she has committed suicide, and her memory has been taken away from her. If Chris fails to identify himself within 3 minutes, he will also become a part of Annie's lost memory forever, and there will be no way out. When Chris hears all this, he realizes that the old man is his mentor, Dr. Albert. He hugs him and becomes hopeful to know that he was his guide before death and is still his guide in the afterlife. Now Chris stands up and starts looking for Annie. He finally finds Annie in the deepest, darkest corner of the house, where she is repetitively saying Christ's name. Chris approaches her and introduces himself, but Annie doesn't recognize him. She thinks of him as some stranger who's pretending to be Chris. Chris makes several attempts to bring back Annie's memory, but they are not good enough for Annie to remember. Chris becomes hopeless and comes outside to Albert. He says that he has failed to bring back her memories, and that he surrenders. Albert gives him emotional support by saying that this wasn't about Annie. The entire journey to hell was for Chris to see where his wife belongs, and that they can never be together. He then asks Chris to return to his place, but Chris says that he has failed as a husband because he couldn't awaken Annie's memories and he deserves to rot in hell for that. He asked Albert to say his goodbyes to Ian and Marie, and goes back inside the house. He holds Annie's hands, but she slowly resists. He reminds her of how good of a wife and mother she was, and how she killed herself when she realized her entire family was dead. Miraculously, Annie's memories slowly start to come back, but Chris' memory starts getting cloudy. When Annie tries to get him out of the dark place, Chris's eyes are closed. When he opens his eyes, he finds himself in his fantasized heaven, which was with Annie and his beautiful dream house. Chris feels lonely but is instantly rejoiced when Annie shows up from behind and greets him. Ian and Mary also showed up in her actual bodies. Annie takes all the time to meet her kids. By the end of the film, Annie suggests that she and Chris should be reborn so they can be together again. Subscribe to see more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.